If only I could sing. Okay. All right. So I thank you everyone for joining us. And of course, thank you to our esteemed panelists, Dr. Shibley Telhami and Noa Landau, who I will introduce in a minute. This is, of course, as I mentioned, a very timely webinar to discuss the latest developments in the region, specifically relating to the Israel and UAE peace agreement. My name is Adina Vogel-Ayalon, and I am J Street's Israel Director, joining you this evening from Tel Aviv. So for J Street and all of us that have been working tirelessly to stop annexation, we welcomed the news on Thursday that Israel had agreed to suspend de jure annexation plans in exchange for normalization of Israel-UAE ties. To note, in Israel, a recent Channel 12 poll suggested that the Israeli public also prefers this outcome, as almost 77% of the Israeli public have noted a clear preference for a peace agreement with the UAE over applying sovereignty to or annexing the Jordan Valley and settlements. As we at J Street said in our statement, this agreement is just the latest evidence that dialogue and diplomacy, rather than unilateral actions, are really the route to long-term security. We recognize that while it is good that de jure unilateral annexation is off the table for the immediate future, the harmful reality of de facto annexation and the continuing occupation is a problem as well. Therefore, we feel that a true comprehensive peace agreement between Israel and its neighbors in the Arab world can only be achieved through an agreement that resolves the issues at the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and leads to the establishment of a viable and independent Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. This surprising development has left us with several questions, especially as immediately following the joint statement on Thursday, Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Zayed offered different interpretations of its implications. MBZ called it a roadmap to normalization rather than a final agreement, while Netanyahu stressed that the suspension of his annexation plan was only temporary. The White House continued to say that annexation is off the table until further notice. So I'm really delighted that we have Noa Landau and Dr. Shibley Telhami with us to help us understand how exactly we got here today, what the implications are of this development for the parties involved, for wider regional dynamics, the reality on the ground for Palestinians, and the long-term prospects for genuine Israeli and Palestinian peace. So I'll take a moment to introduce our esteemed speakers. We have with us Noa Landau, who is Haaretz's diplomatic reporter covering Israel's foreign relations and a member of the newspaper's editorial board. Prior to this, she served as the head of the news department and an editor at Haaretz English edition. And before joining Haaretz, she worked as a news reporter and editor at Galei Tzahal, Channel 10, and Ma'ariv. Noa, many of you who have subscribed to Haaretz are probably very familiar with her writing about all of the things that are relevant to Israel's foreign relations and things that are very relevant, of course, to the core issues that J Street works on. So we're really privileged to have Noa with us today. So thank you, Noa. And Dr. Shibley Telhami, who is a professor for peace and development at the University of Maryland, also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings in the Project on U.S. Relations and the Islamic World, Center for Middle East Policy and the Foreign Policy Program. In the past, Dr. Telhami served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Department of State, advisor to the U.S. mission to the United Nations, advisor to Congressman Lee Hamilton, and as a member of the Iraq Study Group. He is an expert on U.S. policy in the Middle East, Arab politics, shifting political identities in the Arab world. And we've also been privileged to welcome Dr. Telhami on our previous J Streams discussing various issues relating to the Arab world and how annexation, the issue of annexation, was playing out in the Arab world. So I thank you both for being with us today. I will turn first to Noa and then to Dr. Telhami with an opening question, and then I will continue with a follow-up question before opening up for Q&A from the audience. So Noa, the news of this agreement to normalize relations between Israel and the UAE came as a surprise to a lot of us. Right after the agreement was announced, you wrote that the it was clear that all of the parties to President Trump's so-called deal of the century climbed up too high on the annexation tree, and the creative compromise was necessary that would help them climb down to safe ground. Can you take a step back and explain to us the current political moment, how we got here, and how this affects all of the dynamics on the ground in the region and in Israel specifically?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Of course, I hope you read the Haaretz. If not, hurry up and subscribe. So for those of you, I assume that most of you have been following, but for those of you who do not know, we've been basically this whole past year has been only about elections. We had 3 rounds of elections, which never happened in Israel's history before. And if we want to think about the frame, you know, everything that happened, you have to take into consideration that this was mostly, above anything else, a very, very tight election year. And what we saw during these elections is this annexation plan being promoted as part of Netanyahu's election promises, part of the campaign. The first time we heard about the annexation plan, it was actually first it focused about the Jordan Valley. Specifically, it was even before Trump's peace deal was published. And Netanyahu already way before promised as an election promise to annex the Jordan Valley. He said that he thought that it would be in the plan anyways, so it was safe to promise it, even though it wasn't published yet back then. And then the more, you know, we had another election and another election, and the annexation promise just grew with it. And then something that also never happened, at least for the last 10 years in Israel, happened, which is Netanyahu did not exactly win the last round of elections. He had to bring in partners from Kahol Lavan, which is Benny Gantz. And when that happened, and that was a little bit after the plan, the American plan was already published, it was clear that the annexation promise is not going to be so easy as Netanyahu thought it would be. Even before the elections, when the American brought Benny Gantz to Washington with Netanyahu, which was also a very rare situation, and especially, you know, in the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, suddenly Gantz came in as well to Washington. It was already clear that Houston, we have a problem, or annexation, we have a problem, that it's not going to be so easy. And I think since then, since Benny Gantz and Kahol Lavan told the administration that they're actually not willing to take part of it, in DC, this whole plan started to look a little bit less appealing, because if there will be this massive clash within Israel about it, then it's not such a victory for Trump anymore, because he wanted to picture this as something that he did for Israel and that everyone in Israel, you know, love and support and so on. And it was becoming clear that even in the government, there is no understanding around it. In the Israeli public, Adina, like you said, polls back then were already clear that it's not something that everyone wants. And also I have to add the very important role of American Jewry. It was also becoming very clear that within the Jewish community in the United States, everyone is far from supporting this. So the more this became clearer, the more we understood that this plan is not going to actually move forward like Netanyahu promised it. Question was, up to even, I would say, a month ago, will we see a smaller annexation or a formal annexation, as you said, Adina, because you know, we know that many think that annexation is already happening on the ground, but a formal annexation, we thought up to a month ago that, and people in the government thought up to a month ago that maybe we will see something smaller and more symbolic taking place. And according to some of Jared Kushner's briefings, the press in recent days, it's now clear that in the past 2 months, specifically, sent the ambassador of the Emirates to Washington published an op-ed calling Israelis to choose between annexation and normalization. Ever since that offer became public, there has been a very intense and fast negotiation around the option to suspend annexation. That's the official term that they're using, and actually off the table, as we heard from the president, although Ambassador David Friedman says something else, as usual. We can talk about that later if you want. But it was suddenly an option to suspend this whole annexation ban and go for something else. He says that it took 6 weeks to finalize all the details. And a day before the actual announcement, it's when they finalized everything. So it means, it also means that it wasn't, something that was there to begin with. Many now think that maybe this was all about, maybe to begin with, it was like this Hasidic story about the goat that you bring in the house in order to just take it out later, right? So I think from what I'm hearing, you can never tell in the end. So it was such a small group of people that were aware of the secret that you can never really tell. But it sounds to me, from what everyone's now saying, that this was only something that materialized in the last 2 months, when they understood that that they can't have annexation anyways, and they need to settle for something else. So this is why I also wrote in my article that they needed everyone to, go back to the ground of reality and find a compromise that will make everyone happy.
Thank you so much, Noa. Okay, I would like to turn to you, Shibley, to ask you about an article that you published over the weekend about the potential impact of the wall-to-wall democratic opposition to annexation that you described also, and the Biden factor. Can you explain for us how these elements played into the development of an agreement, and what impact does this, does the UAE see this having on future US foreign policy in the region in a potential Biden administration?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for hosting me. So I think, it's not a surprise that the UAE and Israel have been talking to each other. We've known this for years. They've had close relationship, a lot of exchanges, a lot of cooperation in multiple arenas, technology, military, strategic, political, intelligence. This has been going on for some time, with Israelis going in and out of the UAE with special arrangements. So none of this was particularly surprising. That we've known it, by the way, before the Trump administration. Obviously, they've cooperated, particularly on the issue of Iran, when they both kind of opposed the Obama administration position on Iran. So that was not a surprise at all. And it's not a surprise that they both cooperate with the Trump administration. There have been two of the governments in the world who've been among the closest allies of the Trump administration, probably hope for the election of Trump. They've been allies of the Trump administration, perhaps still hope that Trump might get reelected. So all of that is not surprise. I think the timing of the agreement was something of a surprise, and frankly, for the following reason, that as Noah said, I think the Israelis had decided pretty much to freeze annexation already, regardless of what happens with the UAE. And that, in my own opinion, had to do with a lot of reasons, but the principal reason, I think, is actually the uniform democratic position opposing annexation. And let's play this out a little bit more, because I think that should be understood why that was so critical for Israel. Now, obviously, the Israelis have multiple reasons for what they do, including, as we know, domestic politics, and that has been broken for some time. But every government of Israel pays attention to what happens in America, because ultimately, the US is the biggest backer of Israel, and without critical support that it gets, including shielding at the UN, providing a technological edge, Israel would be in a much tougher position. So the support for the U.S. is always absolutely critical for what Israel does. And in this particular case, while both the UAE and Israel may prefer Trump, they read the polls and they know that Biden is likely to win according to the polls. And when you take that into account, the Democrats may even retake the Senate according to some projections. And you look then at what's happening in the Democratic Party on this issue. Uniform opposition to annexation, including from pro-Israel members, and many members of Congress, some members of Congress, suggesting linking annexation to aid to Israel, not just among the progressives, but also among some mainstream members, both in the Senate and the House. And consider, for example, that those aspiring members of the House who would like to replace Eliot Engel as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee have been essentially linking aid to annexation, even those who were traditionally seen to be pro-Israel. And not to mention, of course, the recent performance of the progressives in the primaries that have been even more critical of the Israeli policy than the mainstream Democrats, who've done exceptionally well. And then when you take public opinion polls, including ones that have been carrying out, which show far more openness and criticism, and openness to criticism of Israel and to tying aid to Israel, to Israeli policies, than the mainstream Democrats in Congress express. All of that clearly had to play into the thinking of the Israeli government. It would have been really strange if the Israeli government would start a relationship with a new democratic administration with annexation. That would put them on the wrong foot. When they know they're going to have some tension regardless, not just on Israel-Palestine, maybe that's not going to be even a primary issue, but annexation could make it a primary issue. But on issues like Iran, which is obviously the source of cooperation between the UAE and Israel, that's going to be a source of contention because Biden is likely to go back closer to Obama's policy than he is to Trump's policy. And that's going to be a sore point in the relationship with Israel and with the UAE. So in my opinion, certainly Netanyahu had a lot to gain from ending annexation. This was a great opportunity because he scores big in the relationship with the UAE. We could talk about why that is. I mean, there are lots of reasons why he scores big. He can explain that domestically, even though some of his extremists may not accept it. As you cited the poll, 77% of the public still thinks it's a good deal. It worked for him. And for the UAE, it was a bit of a fig leaf. I think they can use it as an argument that they stopped annexation in doing the deal, but the deal wasn't really about annexation. It was a deal that is strategically beneficial to them. And they're also looking at Washington, including the Democrats. Let me explain why. I think, obviously with Trump, they've had a close relationship and they are doing a favor to Trump, and clearly Trump will exploit this as an international success. So they're doing that. But at the same time, if you look at the Democrats are likely to look at this deal with some favor, in part because they're happy that annexation is taken off the table. It has created a headache for them. And so they're likely to give the UAE some credit for it regardless. And second, Democrats in general, most Democrats, not all Democrats, but most mainstream Democrats have been supportive of normalization with Israel, even aside from what happens on Israel-Palestine. So they're clearly, in a way, it works for both Israel and the UAE, not only with the Trump administration by scoring points in the short term, but it really even sets them up better with a potential Democratic administration. And I think that's really what drove this more than anything else. And of course, let me just end with one thing that I want to say about sort of the Palestinians, because this deal was obviously not about the Palestinians. Whatever they say, it was not either for the UAE or for Israel about the Palestinians. And the Palestinians obviously pay a price because they will continue under occupation after 53 years and no end in sight. But more than that, I would say, and even beyond the normalization that bypasses them with an important Arab country in the Gulf region, I think there may be a cost for them with Democrats. And the cost here is that because the annexation will be off the table for now, and so it's not a pressing issue for Democrats, because Democrats are typically comfortable with normalization even without progress on Israel-Palestine, this might, create a sense of comfort among Democrats not to push harder for resolution of Israel-Palestine. And that is something that everyone has to be worried about, everyone has to be paying attention to.
Thank you. And that point about the Palestinians and emphasizing that point is really a perfect segue into my next question for you, Noa. As I mentioned, there are those of us, and specifically at J Street, that are very concerned about the complete lack of any peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. And we find ourselves troubled in the context of which the UAE and Israel agreement was formed, as it, as you mentioned, overlooked the Palestinians, as Shibley mentioned. Can you weigh in on this, on the implications of this agreement for the future of an agreement or attempts to arrive at a resolution with the Israelis and the Palestinians? From your perspective, what do you think this means for Israelis that are struggling to bring this issue of reaching a settlement with the Palestinians back to the public agenda?
So like everything in Judaism, you have two answers. You can say, I'll start with a more pessimistic approach, then I'll go to the optimistic one so that we can end it with an optimistic too. So the pessimistic view would be that although it was annexation or normalization, it is still annexation and occupation, which before the annexation plan was considered to be a taboo in the Arab world. The vision that was, I would think, most common until now is that until the Palestinian issue would not be resolved in some kind of way, then we will not see these kind of open ties. And as you mentioned, of course, these ties existed before, and we need to take into consideration that everything that we saw now was just publicizing something that was already happening under the table. But still, it was, most people thought that we wouldn't see such an agreement until there is an agreement with Palestinians first. So something did happen, and now we have normalization with occupation, which whoever's more pessimistic about it could claim that actually harms the fight to end occupation and strive to some kind of a peace agreement with Palestinians, who are, our neighbors that we need to sign an agreement with more than maybe countries in the Gulf that we already actually had secret relations with. But on the other hand, I think that if you look at the broader picture from maybe two angles, first one is that, like also we mentioned, most Israelis thought it was a good idea to drop annexation, and they support the deal that was made. And also, again, I agree that it might be that dropping annexation was just an excuse for both sides to do something that they wanted to do anyways. That's true as well. But still, publicly, the fact that many Israelis support the narrative, whether it's true or not, that it was an exchange for dropping annexation, means that they were against it, and it means something about them supporting peace, whatever it means. So this is from a more optimistic view. Also, I think it's important to remember that once you bring in a new player officially and publicly into your house, which is Israel, bringing in the Emirates into Israel publicly, having an official embassy, not in Jerusalem, but in Tel Aviv, and an official ambassador, it also means that they are going to have opinions about things that happen in Israel while they have an ambassador in the country. And he will probably have opinions about, things that Israel does from time to time regarding occupation. So if there's another, E1 issue, something, or more than that, something with Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque. If anything happens, like we saw a few years ago, that will prevent or limit the access of Palestinians to Temple Mount, they will have an opinion about it. So I think it's also fair to say that, yes, on one hand, this is enabling the normalization happen with occupation without demanding it to end. It's a problem, it's bad news for Palestinians for sure. But on the other hand, there is also maybe an opportunity. There is an opportunity in public opinion because, again, we saw that people prefer not to annex the settlements in the West Bank. And for sure, they prefer a different scenario, which has the word peace in it. Again, depends how you describe it, but this is how people were how this story is sold in Israel. And that's a positive point. And also, I think it's an opportunity to have a new player officially in the region that is crushable. You can, they will have to deal with a lot of pressures from the Muslim world for having an official embassy here, and they would be, expected to act accordingly, and there will be new opportunities. Also, I want to mention that for many Israeli peace activists, those who still exist, it's not a big community, but for those who still exist, maybe there's an opportunity now to speak with the Arab world in a way that didn't exist before. I mean, think about it. Now you have, just a few days ago, if we heard about, I don't know, a J Street Israel delegation talking to, people in the Gulf, explaining to them the problems of the occupation, it would be like, treason in Israel. But now there's peace. We can tell them everything about the occupation that maybe they don't know.
Very interesting take. And you took me also exactly to one of the points that I wanted to ask you, Shibley, to pick up on, which is exactly this analysis about how this deal could actually be good for Palestinians down the line as Arab states, if more Arab states follow suit, have leverage over Israel specifically on this issue, which is, I think, a very interesting analysis. So I would love for you to touch on that, and also, go the same question that I asked Noah: what are the implications of this agreement for future attempts at arriving at a resolution between Israelis and Palestinians, and specifically what this also means for the future of the Arab Peace Initiative, how the Palestinians could strategize in response to an agreement, potentially regarding the leveraging comment and analysis, and also several questions I'm trying to throwing into you before we open it up to the Q&A. But if you see the other Arab countries quickly following suit, and if the Arab League would also back potentially the positions of the Palestinians, as we've seen them come out very critically against this deal. Oh, Shibley, you are muted.
Sorry. Overall, there's no question this is not good for the Palestinians. I think to pretend that it is really an exaggeration. Of course, there's going to be some elements of benefits to the Palestinians indirectly, but overall, this is a strategic shift that undermines them. Look at the way Netanyahu and Likud are pushing this peace for peace. That we don't have to do anything on Israel-Palestine. And so forth. Of course, the UAE is going to maybe voice some opinion, but in the end, that's not why they got into it. There will be a lot of other incentives related more to the strategic cooperation, the relationship with Iran, the relationship with the U.S. and so forth that are going to trump anything to do with the Palestinians. In that, the Palestinians pay a heavy price. They are the ones who paid the biggest price. This is really at their cost, not for their benefit. And I don't see, you could pull in threads and say maybe they'll benefit a little economically or voice here and there, but a strategic shift. Now, how does this impact the other question, which is how does this impact the Arab world broadly? I think, it's hard to know, but I could say a couple of things. Obviously, Israel has been reaching out to Arab states behind the scenes for years, and in recent years, obviously with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, and Sudan, particularly those countries, with the active participation and push of the Trump team, including bringing the weight of the U.S. government behind these efforts, and they have, and the UAE wasn't the only one, as you know. The Omanis and the Bahrainis were very much on the front of this, and there's some contacts with the Saudis as well. Question is whether these countries will follow, and whether they'll follow sooner or later. To me, it's improbable that the UAE had done this without some consultation with key allies. By key allies, I mean probably the Saudis and the Egyptians, who are really their key allies on this. And at least maybe they didn't give their say they would. The Saudis may not have said that they would follow. But I think that certainly there's the question is who's criticizing them. When you look at the field, their key allies are not outwardly criticizing them. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, even Jordan, which has been not really kind of a key member of this alliance, just sort of a support group. So you don't really find any weighty Arab governments coming in against it. So in some ways that gives them some leeway. It's hard to know where public opinion is in the Arab world. It's divided. And obviously social media can't be trusted to analyze exactly how much weight different segments of the public have. So it's still a fluid environment. But my guess is that still most Arabs probably opposed to this, the public opinion, but public opinion hasn't been mattering much in the counter-revolution that has followed the Arab the Arab uprisings in 2011, 2012. So I think there's going to be a period in which we're going to see some major shifts taking place in the Arab world. Everybody's going to see how this plays itself out between Israel and the UAE. And my guess is, don't forget that the key element here, the key element is not just that Arab governments in Israel see some interest, common interest. The key element here is you have a superpower, the most important country in the world, the most influential country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, throwing its weight behind this effort as part of its project on the Middle East. So this is what's going on here with the Trump administration. And what I think we're likely to witness in the next few months is an assessment on the Trump administration part about what is going to be its priority prior to the election. Is it going to be to push for having a couple of other clicks in normalization between Arab states and Israel? Or is it going to be the Iran file, which looms large? And that obviously, if you take a look at what's happened just in the last couple of days with the Trump administration failing to get the UN to extend the embargo on Iran, that was a huge failure at the UN. Not just China and Russia didn't even have to veto because the Trump administration couldn't get members to vote on in favor of its resolution. The president is again pressing to use the clause in the agreement from which the U.S. withdrew to put back the sanctions on. It's not going to work. And I think the question then will be whether Israel and the Trump administration will see Iran more of a priority than additional agreements between Israel and the Arab states.
Thank you. So now I'm going to turn to the questions from our viewers and follow up on some of the points that you made. I would like to ask Noa a question from Debbie Schlossberg about what you think the outcome would be if slash when Israel continues its de facto or creeping annexation. Do you see this as being something that will force the UAE to bolt? Will they ignore it? How much will they actually care?
Hi, Debbie. First of all, journalists should not be prophets. We saw the UK before Brexit. We saw America before Trump. I'm now skeptical about polls in America as well. I don't think we should predict the future. So the short answer is we don't know. But I do think that it will definitely cause dilemmas. And when you have dilemmas and when you have pressures and when you have another actor in the picture, then there are also opportunities. And it doesn't mean, I agree that the picture doesn't look good for Palestinians, but I guess people who support J Street still have hope for change, which is why they're involved. And I think there will definitely be new opportunities, even if the challenge would be harder on many aspects.
Thanks, Noa. We definitely will not bolt. That is for sure. A question from Vogel-Ayalon for Shibley. If this agreement and potential other agreements with Gulf nations undermines the Palestinians, could it perhaps back the Palestinians into more of a corner and mean that they would be more willing to make concessions in future negotiations?
No, I don't think that's the way it works. And frankly, I mean, let's look at this strategically. Of course, Arab support for the Palestinians is important. It's important psychologically. It's important for the international community. It's important in many ways. So losing Arab support is big for even Arab government support for the Palestinians. It would even be bigger if they lose Arab public opinion, because ultimately, you know, governments are sensitive, even if they're not in the short term. We've seen it shifting over time. But let's also keep in perspective that you know, the biggest shift took place at Camp David in the relationship between Egypt and Israel with the agreement in 1979 following the Camp David Accords. And that was a huge shift, where the biggest Arab country that had the biggest military potential vis-a-vis Israel essentially had a peace treaty with Israel and undermined the leverage of Palestinians. The Egyptians sought actually to you know, build Egyptian nationalism, and of course they were opposed by the PLO and opposed to the PLO at the time as the Palestinian representative of the Palestinian people. And yet look at what's happened. I mean, even though Egypt still has a peace treaty, the Egyptian people still don't really want to normalize with Israel. There is no war and peace. And the Egyptian government still has failed to kind of create any kind of identity that doesn't take into account the relationship between Egypt and the Palestinians. I think there is a dynamic here even that transcends Arab governments that you have to keep in mind. But ultimately, the problem for Israel is much more than what the Arabs will do about Palestinians. The Israeli governments don't have unilateral solutions with the Palestinians. By the way, when you look at it, you know, obviously Israel and South Africa are not exactly identical with regard to the West Bank. But if you look at what happened even in South Africa, the pressure that ultimately came that created change was not so much from African countries. Many of the African governments actually were cooperating with South Africa at that time. And the pressure came from the international community. It came from the West. It came from public opinion, and it had to do more with equality. I think the question is whether this conflict now will be transformed when people take into account that maybe this occupation isn't reversible. Arab states are not going to come and create a two-state solution suddenly. It's going to be an issue about rights. And when it's about rights internationally, domestically, actually the Palestinians have more on their side globally. So I think it might help transform the conflict in a way, probably ultimately lead to the kind of more and more people concluding two states is impossible. and seeing this conflict more and more in terms of a conflict over rights and equality and freedom and democracy. And the Palestinians have an edge with public opinion regardless of what our governments do. And by the way, I want to have you think about this for a minute, because that's forgotten. And just note for particularly American supporters of genuine peace in the Middle East that takes Jews and Arabs into account, Palestinians and Israelis into account. Think about this, that most of the people who advocate for that are certainly angry with a right-wing Israeli government. They're also angry with some of the same governments that Israel is making peace with, right? Because they don't see them as on the same values side in the Arab world. I mean, that's the issue, I think, that is likely to lead to a different set of coalitions emerging in public opinion, particularly in the US, in approaching the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Thank you, Shibley. I want to turn us to some questions regarding domestic Israeli politics for Noa and how this development factors into the situation on the ground here in Israel. So I'm going to touch on a few different questions from our viewers. One question from Mark Fenton is about how Netanyahu's trial, if it did figure at all into this decision, and about the mass protests and demonstrations in Israel against Netanyahu currently, and how they are playing into this bigger picture. There's another question here about the polls and how this has affected Netanyahu in the polls as of right now. And then one last question that I'm going to throw at you in this bunch is how does this affect the settlement expansion process? And what Netanyahu may or may not do now that annexation is off the table in the framework of elections, what he might do to appease his more right-wing settler base.
Regarding the trial, it depends on your perspective. Some people in Israel claim that everything has to do with Netanyahu's trial, that you should judge any decision, any campaign, any promise around the trial. I personally think that it's more complicated. I think that for many years, I personally heard Netanyahu talking about, shifted the pyramid shift and showing that we can reach peace with the Arab world before with the Palestinians and so on. I mean, it's something that he spoke about way before he knew that he's going to be on trial. But of course, these things as they happen, they're intertwined. You can't really separate one from another. And the demonstrations, it doesn't seem like they were affected at all from the recent events. In Israel, many people speak since Prime Minister Ehud Olmert went to trial. There was a claim that he was treated better by left-wing journalists because he was involved in peace efforts. And Netanyahu says many times that, if I only gave up pieces of the land of Israel, then I wouldn't be on trial and these kind of things. It didn't help Olmert to escape trial. He went to prison, so it's a weird claim. But in any case, right now for the left wing, the peace that Netanyahu brought with countries that we already had the secret relations with are not enough to disregard the corruption claims. People are still on the streets. They're still demonstrating against him. I think less of it than before, but it has to do with more of the economy and COVID questions, not the hardcore people who demonstrate against corruption. They're very persistent, and this doesn't touch them at all. That doesn't matter at all. In polls, the same. You see that He's not, it's not as bad as it was when we saw that there's real rage around COVID and the financial situation. But it doesn't look like these recent developments made a massive change in his political situation among supporters. And you have to also remember that in Israel, right now, we're at a point where, I mean, we saw this for 3 election rounds. Right now, if you're against Netanyahu, you're against him almost about everything. If you support him almost about everything. So it's really hard to change these like organic blocks that we have in Israeli politics at the moment around supporting or not supporting Netanyahu. The only ones who kind of shift are the right wing that is more far right from Netanyahu. And then you see that Naftali Bennett has massive growing support that we didn't see before. I mean, he almost did not enter Knesset at all in the second round of elections. So right now, suddenly he's climbing in the polls. That again has more to do with COVID than this issue. Settlements, I think Israel will continue with the creeping annexation and so on. Settlements will always, as one of the senior settlers told me just a few days ago, when he heard that annexation is not on the table anymore, he said, we have patience. I mean, fine, it would have been nice to annex 30%. Some of them were actually very much against it because they wanted 100%. So we'll wait for a different opportunity and we'll do it then. And meanwhile, there'll be another road, another house, another tree, and you know, just like they've done for all these years. I still think, as I said before, that it will be with, I mean, at least until the elections in November, it looks like the White House does not want these kinds of interference. It looks like it's not a benefit to see Israel now, you know, shaking things too much. That's why they didn't want annexation, and it's probably why they wouldn't want anything massive on settlements.
That's very interesting to note. We'll have to wait and see, I guess, as things advance, as we know that there are, you know, still plans within E1, Givat HaMatos, that are sort of on hold, potential opportunities for them to move forward. We'll see how that moves forward in the
But I just want to mention on that point of like plan announced, it's very important to notice that plans are always announced all the time. Question is it a plan or is it really going to happen? Because there's a massive difference. And many times Netanyahu, just to make his right-wing settler base happy, announces plans that never actually happen.
I think that's a really important point. Thank you, Noa, for clarifying. Shibley, I want to take us back to the Arab world and ask you a few questions. One question is from Elaine Rubin about the effects that this will have on Qatar, given its support for Gaza. Another question is from Richard Letterman about how do you see Iran and its allies responding to this agreement, and is following that, do you see a potential for increased military activity against Iranian targets in the near future?
Sure. So first of all, with regard to Iran and Turkey, they have taken the lead in criticizing this agreement as key states, influential states in the region. So it's interesting that it's non-Arab states that have taken this lead. One of the fascinating things about what happened in the Arab world after the Arab uprisings, because of the divisions and the civil wars and the weakening of Arab states, what happened in Iraq really after the Iraq war that neutralized Iraq as a key player in Arab politics, what's happened in Syria that has weakened its role in Arab politics. Then you have this coalition of states that are really together more or less on many issues, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, and then a set of states that are sort of dependent on that coalition that doesn't really take them on, even if they disagree with them. In some cases, they agree with them. And so there is no real forceful Arab country that takes on this. And remember, when Egypt did go its way and break from the Arab consensus and make peace with Israel, the Arab states boycotted Egypt, even though it was the most powerful Arab state and it was the Arab League used to be in Cairo. Egypt was expelled from the Arab League, and there was Arab states were able to take position on this. But there is no one like that right now, and there is no consensus in that direction. So a lot of the opposition is coming from Iran and Turkey. That has its limits, in part because these countries have obviously taken a position in the divide in the Arab world, whether it's in Syria, in the Gulf, or over the Qatar issue. And therefore their influence has its limits. I'm not sure what it will be able to do other than perhaps offer some support for the Palestinians. The Palestinians, certainly the PA, the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, find it hard to bypass the Arab states because they're tied to the Arab state. Hamas is a different story, but nothing dramatic would change in that regard. So I think that kind of position is not likely, that is the position of Turkey and Iran, is not likely to really dramatically affect what's happening in the Arab world. As for Qatar, you know, this is kind of an interesting and ironic case because Qatar was one of the first countries to improve relations with Israel, particularly back after, before even the Oslo agreements, after the Madrid conference and the multilaterals, and opened up a commercial office for Israel in Qatar, and had Al Jazeera, it's you know, the TV station that it backs, had representation in Israel, the first Arab world to have representative in Israel covering the story, but they have shied away from having official ties with Israel. In this particular case, they're going to be in a bit of a tough bind. On the one hand, they will criticize the UAE because the UAE obviously has become an opponent, as have the Saudis in isolating Qatar. And that does mean that, particularly in the public relations fight, where the space, the media space is limited, where the Saudi media, the Egyptian media, the UAE media, those are really the clusters, big clusters of media in the region, are not likely to attack the UAE on this. And so the bulk of the criticism is going to come from the Qatari media, and particularly Al Jazeera. And that's likely to intensify. We see it already. So I think, other than that, though, I'm not sure that Qatar has many assets in its hand to impact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay, and so now we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask each of you a last question, and also if you have any last remarks that you would like to add. I'll start with Noah's last question from Rabbi Mark Dworkin. Do you think that this agreement could somehow benefit how Israel is treated at the UN?
That's an interesting question. Can't really see how this will change old patterns if we think about also veto, etc. It is maybe interesting to mention that if we spoke before about the weapon embargo and the US efforts that fail in the Security Council, that Israel, and I believe that also the US, are actually more interested in a snapback scenario than they were in the vote at the Security Council. From what I hear from Israeli officials, this is the preferred scenario, to see the resolution fail at the Security Council and then maybe try hard for the snapback, which I also think does not have really serious chance, but still it's what they would prefer to see, which I think is maybe interesting. Regarding other resolutions, I think there's a very consistent pattern of voting at the UN that Israel hasn't been really successful in changing with all the efforts that they were pouring into it. I did hear from, there's now, a new foreign minister, and I heard from people around him that he's talking about a more, let's say, a more blunt conversation about things that Israel expects in return from its friends around the world, including voting patterns. But I don't really think that we can see a massive change.
Thanks, Noah. Shibley, would you like to add on to that? Because I wanted to ask you one other final question.
Go ahead and ask that.
Okay, so I'm happy for you to respond to that, and also ask you about if this agreement has any impact on the chances of reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah.
Well, that I can answer very quickly. Probably not. I mean, of course, it's in their interest to come together, but the divisions are serious, and unfortunately, like the case in Israel, domestic politics, Palestinian domestic politics, sometimes doesn't make any sense in terms of the interest of Palestinians or the interest of foreign policy. It'll give them incentive, but I'm not sure it'll lead to more success. But I want to add something that's a little bit broader. You said, is this going to affect Israel at the UN? Of course, it might not, and I agree with Noah. I think probably not much. I think that's the agreement. But there is something here that's bigger than that, right? Because when we say the UN, we're not just talking about how states are going to vote there. We're talking about the importance of the multilateral efforts, the importance of international law, the importance of UN resolution. And those are really the anchors that still frame potential settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. And frankly, that the biggest thing in the Trump peace plan and his effort was to bypass those references that no one is accepting, not the Arabs, even when they pursue their own peace in their own national interest, that bypass the Palestinians. Those are enduring. And ultimately, the need for peace between Israel and the Palestinians and the need to end the occupation isn't because some Arab country wants it. That, of course, is important for states to consider about the prospects and possibilities. The need is principled. The need is humanitarian. The need is international law. It's about equality. It's about human rights. And I think in the end, all of this is important for geopolitics, but it's not going to, and it shouldn't divert us from the urgency to address what is unacceptable situation of occupation, where Palestinians, after 53 years, still suffer under occupation. More than 90% of Palestinians were born under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. Many of them have never known any freedom their entire lives. They're born and died. And my worry more about the agreement right now is not so much what it'll do between Israel and the UAE. My worry about what it'll do to those people, all of us, who want to see a just and enduring end that takes, that addresses the genuine aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians, of Jews and Arabs. I am worried that it might result in complacency. This was never about annexation. Formal annexation is, of course, important technically in relation to the law. It is about what's happening on the ground. And we have had de facto annexation taken place and control of Palestinian lives that is not changing. And the worry is that we fall into complacency to think that all is good now, we can go back to business as usual. We can't, because it is still a genuinely depressing environment that we all must pay attention to.
So on that note, I want to thank you both for your commitment to this issue, of course, for being with us and sharing your analysis with us on these recent developments. Of course, as I mentioned, we at J Street will continue to follow the developments on the ground, both in relation to the occupation and to de facto annexation, and we'll continue to mobilize our constituents on these issues, while welcoming, of course, that diplomatic resolutions and peace agreements are always preferable. So we will continue to carry that flag. I want to mention and encourage all of our viewers to go onto J Street's website to view the different programming that we have throughout the Democratic National Convention this week. We also on J School have on Wednesday a webinar about core issues with Professor Galia Golan, and I encourage everyone to continue to follow updates regarding our programming, our virtual programming during this time. Thank you again, Noa and Shibley. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And look forward to future cooperation and conversations. And good night to Noa, and good afternoon to Shibley.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you, Adina.